Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us again, well, hopefully again, for another buzzword breakdown, where we take a popular term that's out there in the digital ecosystem, marketplace, and something that's buzzing around and try to break it down into bite-sized chunks, some actionable items, things that you can take back to your business or your campaigns and apply them there and get more value out of that. That's what we hope to intend to do here. Before I get too far into that, a little bit of housekeeping. As always, we will follow up with an email with a recording of the presentation. And if you have questions, please put them in the question box. We will try to get to those during the call. And if not, we, again, will follow up in the email and answer those questions there. And today, for our buzzword, we're going to be breaking down ROAS, return on ad spend. So super excited about this. And just to tell you a little bit about myself, if you haven't been on a call before, I'm Bob Batchelor. I've been with AdTaxi now for a little over 3 years, and Director of Customer Experience. And I'd like to say I've been around since before Facebook started. And to prove my age, I went out on Sunday and played lacrosse and blew my knee out because I still think that I'm 20. But that's what digital marketing will do. It kind of keeps you young, keeps you on the forefront. But super happy to have Drew Supez with us. He's going to be walking us through ROAS. He's our client services manager and expert at client campaign success. Drew has a big team, and he oversees a lot of campaigns and a lot of clients, and is always looking on how to improve the customers and always looking into metrics. Okay, how's this person doing in this? And how's this business doing in that metric? And one of the ones he falls back to a lot is ROAS, and why we're bringing this to you today. So super excited to have Drew with us on that. He's also father of 3 children. I'm not sure how he does it. I only have 2. As one of my friends said, I have one-to-one defense. Now he's playing zone defense. So without further ado, I will pass it on to Drew.
Thanks, Bob. Yeah, I'm not very good at zone defense, apparently. But so for today's webinar, we're going to get started by defining ROAS, or return on ad spend. ROAS is obviously the acronym for return on ad spend, so you may hear either or throughout the presentation. We'll walk you through what you need to get started. Lastly, we're going to spend a good amount of time diving into some examples. I do warn you, though, there will be some math involved, but don't worry. We'll walk you through the calculations so that you hopefully feel confident applying these principles to your business. So before we define ROAS, I would like to differentiate between ROAS, which is ROAS, and ROI, which is an acronym for return on investment. I often see these two terms get mixed up quite a bit. They're similar, but they're a little bit different. So what's the difference? ROI, as stated previously, is an acronym for return on investment. The primary function of an ROI calculation is to determine profitability. Meanwhile, ROAS, which is an acronym for return on ad spend, the primary function of an ROAS calculation is to measure advertising campaign performance by incorporating revenue generated and ad spend. So if you do a quick Google search, you'll find a definition out there. Here's one that I grabbed. Return on advertiser spend, ROAS, is a marketing metric that measures the efficacy of a digital advertising campaign. ROAS helps online businesses evaluate which methods are working and how they can improve future advertising efforts. So hopefully that differentiates for us. Now that we've made that distinction, for the purposes of our session today, we're going to focus on ROAS. And here's why. In the digital advertising space, we're rarely provided access to our clients' profit margins. And so that makes it almost impossible to calculate ROI. However, the process for calculating return on ad spend is at our fingertips. As long as we have access to ad spend, which we should, and revenue generated, which we could estimate. ROAS, it's an actual mathematical formula, which you can see illustrated here. ROAS equals gross revenue divided by advertising dollars spent. So why is it important to calculate ROAS? Well, establishing and understanding my ROAS allows me to measure the effectiveness of my digital marketing campaigns. And in doing so, I'm able to make necessary adjustments so that I could achieve the goal of maximizing my marketing investment. Okay, so let's get started. As a business owner, my ultimate goal is obviously going to be sales and revenue. But most digital marketing is meant to drive traffic to a business's website, and not every business is set up to process sales on their website. So in order to measure ROAS, we first need to determine the primary goal of my website. And so it generally fits into one of three categories. First, I need to ask myself, what is the primary function of my website? Am I looking for sales? Then the primary goal likely fits into the e-commerce category. An example would be any online retailer. But let's say I'm looking to generate phone calls or appointments. Then my primary goal likely fits into the lead generation category, or lead gen. Think of a plumber, any business that needs to schedule an appointment. You know, a lot of home improvement categories, or the category of home improvement, there's a lot of businesses there. So plumber, but also a doctor's office, anywhere, like I said, that appointment needs to be scheduled. Lastly, you gotta ask yourself, do I want my shoppers coming to my site so that they can consume and engage with the information, with the ultimate goal of driving those customers to my brick and mortar locations? If this is the case, then I likely fall into the offline sales category. A lot of our advertisers fall in this category. Think of an auto dealer, or really any business that has a brick and mortar location. So now that I have a good idea of the category my business best relates to, let's discuss what we should be tracking and how. So for the e-commerce campaign, we will obviously want to track revenue and transactions, as well as full funnel tracking so that we can monitor customer activity from product pages to the shopping cart and all the steps throughout the checkout process. But for the lead gen campaign, we're likely going to want to track phone calls, or if there's a way to schedule an appointment online, we should track form submissions as well. Lastly, if there's a chat functionality on the site, we'll want to keep track of these too. For the offline sales campaign, it's going to be specific to the website, but there's one key metric that we like to track here at AdTaxi, and that's product page views. So think of like a luxury furniture store who includes product information on their site, but they require their customers to visit a brick and mortar location to transact. These product pages these product pages include key information that's going to help our customers get the information they need and direct them to the store. So we definitely want to track these pages. Additionally, it's usually best practice to keep track of engaged visitors. A lot of times that's measured in pages per visit. So how do we track this behavior? Customer interactions are best tracked through pixels, which I imagine most people are familiar with what a pixel is, but in case not, it's a snippet of code that's placed on your website. One of the common tools used is Google Analytics, and that's used to measure customer engagement on your website. But when you're comparing digital campaign performance, it's best practice to measure within the individual platforms as well. These platforms being Facebook, Google, just a couple platforms to name. In most cases, the platform will be able to provide additional layers of information that you may not see in Google Analytics. So that's why it's important to make sure that you're tapping into the platform as well. For phone tracking, we're able to place a pixel. Similarly, it's a snippet of code that goes on a website that can dynamically change the phone number to a tracking number so that we can monitor call volume based on your marketing channel. Okay, so now that we have a good idea of what metrics to track and how to track it, let's start calculating return on ad spend. So we're going to walk you through several simplified examples. So for the purposes of this webinar, the goal is for you guys to understand the logic and the general math behind creating the return on ad spend calculation so that you could try it with your business. So we understand that each business is unique, and if you run into any sort of difficulties along the way, as Bob pointed out, shoot us a note, reach out to our team, and we'd be happy to help with you. So that being said, let's jump into an e-commerce example. These are usually the easiest ones to calculate. So we'll start easy and then we'll end with the more complicated ones. So let's say we own an online bike retail store where all of our transactions are completed on the website. Before we dive into this example, the main takeaways for you guys are going to be applying the ROAS formula and then benchmarking your ROAS. So in this scenario, the primary metric that we're tracking is revenue. I also provided the ROAS calculation up at the top for everyone to reference. So let's say we spent $1,000 on advertising and we generated, say, $3,000 in revenue. Pretty simple calculation there if we look at the ROAS formula, revenue divided by ad spend. So if we do that, it gives us the number 3, obviously. So some businesses use, what they'll do is they'll give it a multiplier. So in this case, we would see a 3x return on ad spend. Others convert this to a percentage by multiplying by 100. So that would give us a 300% return on ad spend. Either one works. I see it pretty commonly used, kind of across the board, either or. So in this scenario, you're probably asking, well, we drove a 300% ROAS. Is that good? On the surface, yeah, that looks good, right? We spent 1,000, we generated 3,000. So more on that here on the next slide. Another question, kind of a follow-up to that would be, well, what is an ideal ROAS? And the answer to that is it's going to vary based on your business. So even if there's 2 online bike stores competing, let's call it even in the same market, an ideal ROAS for one bike retailer is likely going to be a little bit different than the other. And so let me show you why. So let's answer the first question, which was, does a 300% ROAS mean that the campaign was successful? So we generated $3,000 in revenue, but let's say we racked up, call it $2,000 in business costs on top of the $1,000 we spent on advertising. So in this case, we actually broke even. So as a business owner, it's paramount that I tell my digital marketing partner that a successful campaign needs to be at or above a 300% ROAS in order for me to walk away from this saying that this worked for my business. Hopefully this makes sense. So the other question that I brought up is, okay, is this 300% ROAS, is this an ideal across the board? Does it fall within a certain industry standard? But as business people, you well know that costs are going to vary from business to business. And so in order to establish what we're calling here a break-even ROAS, your business is going to need to factor in your costs. And so you're really going to need to factor that in order to calculate what a successful ROAS might look like for you. And as I mentioned earlier, if you guys need help or assistance in doing this, please reach out to our team. We could provide some assistance and help you out. So we've covered off on e-commerce, pretty straightforward, but our goal there was to introduce you guys with the formula itself, and then to address whether there's a standard ROAS that we should shoot for. So in our next example, we're going to take a look at a lead gen scenario. So in this case, let's just imagine ourselves as a plumber. So The main takeaway from this example is I want to be able to show you guys how, one of the methods, I guess, to calculate ROAS when my website doesn't track revenue. And so a plumber's fitting in this scenario, because most of their business is going to be done, you know, via appointment after a phone call has been made. So in this plumber scenario, the primary metric that we're tracking is phone calls. Pretty straightforward there. And as you recall, in order to calculate ROAS, we need ad spend and revenue. So as a plumber, will we know the ad spend? Yes, we should know what we're spending on advertising. Will we know the revenue? And the answer is no, but let me clarify for a minute. Obviously, a business owner is going to know what the revenue looks like, but they're going to have difficulty attributing that revenue to their advertising campaign. Hopefully that makes sense. So this is what we're hoping to solve for in this situation. So if the primary metric that we're tracking from our website is phone calls, then we need to figure out how to assign a dollar value to each phone call. Now, one way to assign revenue would be to match our CRM data to a call list that's provided and determine which calls converted to revenue. I've done this before. It works pretty effectively, but let's assume that we as a business don't feel comfortable providing our digital marketing partner with access to our CRM. Or let's say we don't have the time to match each phone call from our advertising campaign to a transaction each month on our end. So there's another way to do this. The best way is to start with the end goal in mind. So in this case, a transaction. And then we're going to work backwards to connect our transaction to an online metric, which in this case is phone calls for a plumber. Now we just need to determine the steps in between these two metrics. So what precedes a transaction? And again, I'm oversimplifying this process, but again, the goal is for you guys to understand the principle behind it. So as a plumber, we need an in-person appointment before a transaction is made. And so what likely precedes an appointment? Probably a phone call. And so now we have our path to transaction, and that ties back to the marketing campaign. So let's say that the average ticket value is somewhere around $1,000. And on average, half of our appointments lead to a transaction. And if we pull historical call volume reports and estimate that half of our phone calls lead to appointments, okay, so now we have a way to assign a value to a phone call. For every transaction, we require 2 appointments. You guys could do the math. And for us to generate 2 appointments, we need the phone to ring 4 times. So 4 phone calls in this case equals 1 transaction valued at $1,000. So 4 phone calls equals $1,000. Again, these are estimates. The easy math allows us to take 4 into 1,000, giving us a value of, call it $250 per phone call. So now we have successfully assigned revenue to our phone call metric. And let's jump into the next scenario here. So now that we've assigned that value to the phone call, we could calculate revenue generated and ROAS from our ad campaign. So let's do the first one. So let's say we had 40 calls from a marketing campaign, last month. And we know that each call is valued at $250. Some simple math allows us to estimate around $10,000 in revenue from our marketing efforts. So if we plug this into our ROAS formula, let's say we spent $2,000 on advertising with $10,000 in revenue. This gives us a 500% ROAS. Now, if we want to determine our minimal viable ROAS, we would need to factor in our business costs like we discussed in our previous example, which we're not gonna go into that, but you guys have the blueprint for what that should look like. Hopefully you guys are following along pretty well, but if you do have any questions, just shoot us a note. So for our last example, we're going to take a look at offline sales. So it gets a little bit more complicated in this scenario, but let's pick an auto dealer. And so for everyone following along, the main takeaways are going to be for us to discuss estimating revenue when I have no e-commerce functionality on my website and phone calls are not my primary website goal. And so for this example, an auto dealer fits the mold, but there's a lot of other businesses out there that fit this scenario. I also want to discuss converting our metrics into a net value, which will make for an easier application with our marketing efforts. Okay. Let's say that the primary function of our website, in this case, is to lead a customer to product information. So in that case, the end goal would be to drive traffic to our brick and mortar location, but we're going to give them information on my website that allows them to make a decision on whether or not they want to go to my brick and mortar location and hopefully buy a car. So in this case, the industry standard for an auto dealer is looking at what we call vehicle description pages, so also known as VDPs. So the same as before, we're going to work to connect our online metric, which in this case is a VDP view, to the transaction so that we could assign a dollar amount to a VDP view. But in order to do so, we need to map out the steps in between. So I know that this is going to be quite an oversimplification of this process. So obviously, in this case, what I'm grouping into one is an in-person visitor, but understanding that most of us have likely shopped for a car. There's your first visit. There might be a second visit. There's test driving vehicles. There's there's obviously a process in the middle of that, but I'm grouping everything for the purposes of this example into just in-person visits. And so so let's say that an average transaction is somewhere in the neighborhood of, we'll call it $35,000. And I imagine most dealerships keep really good track of their customer behavior. And so they should be able to calculate the likelihood of that person to convert on the sale. And so in this case, let's assume that 10% of first-time visitors will actually result in a transaction. So that's assuming that they're keeping track in their CRM, and they're likely keeping good tabs on their salespeople's close ratios. So this shouldn't be too difficult for them to find. Okay, so now we're going to want to calculate the ratio of VDPs, or what we called before vehicle description page visits, to documented in-person visitors. And so let me say that again. So we're going to calculate the ratio of VDPs to in-person visitors. And so in order to do so, we're going to look at historical CRM data, and we're going to compare that with historical VDP data. And so again, this is an estimate, but this is an appropriate way to go about it. So this should give us a ballpark VDP to visitor ratio. So let's say we determine that there is a ratio of 20:1, meaning for every 20 VDPs, we could expect to see one in-person visitor. This means 5% of customers researching vehicles on our website will end up visiting the dealership. It's obviously a much lower number than than the previous example. But again, these numbers are fabricated. Like these are in here. If you're an auto dealer on the call, I tried to go ballpark here, but don't take these for granted that these are actual rates associated with an actual dealership. These are just averages. So let's assign a value to the VDP view. And so the same as before, we're going to work backwards. So in order to generate one transaction, we're going to need 10 in-person visitors, right? So 10% close rate, that means 1 out of every 10 buys a car. And in order to generate 10 in-person visitors with that 20-to-1 ratio, remember, we're going to need around 200 VDP views. So in this case, hopefully that makes sense. 20-to-1 VDPs to 1 in-person visitor. For every 10 in-person visits equals 1 transaction. So now we've mapped the process, and now it's going to be easier for us to assign a value to a VDP. So now we know that 200 VDPs equals $35,000, or when divided down, 1 VDP equals $175. Hopefully that makes sense. Now that we have a gross value for VDPs, that $175, let's try to estimate the net value of a VDP. So let's say our marketing efforts drove 1,000 VDPs. Let's call it 1,000 VDPs last month. We could estimate that we drove $175,000 in revenue, right? Each VDP is valued at $175, 1,000 VDPs. On the marketing side, we're going to look at this and say, wow, we generated a lot of revenue from those 1,000 VDPs. But let's calculate the net value of that. And so most of you probably know this, but auto dealers operate with a very thin margin. So let's assume that, again, I'm just throwing this number out there. Let's just assume that 5% of the $175,000 is profit, which gives us $8,750. So obviously not as large of a number as the estimated revenue. So let's look to calculate the net value of an individual VDP. And so we're estimating that 175 is the gross value of VDP, and we are operating on a 5% profit margin, which, doing the math, would give us an estimated net value of $8.75 per VDP. Now, this value is probably the most meaningful as it relates to our digital marketing campaign. And so as a business owner, it's paramount that this auto dealer uses this number, this $8.75, and communicates it to their digital marketing partner so that they can use it as a benchmark when we're discussing campaign expectations. And so this is now what success looks like for us. So in order for this campaign to be successful, we need to maintain a below $8.75 cost per VDP. Hopefully this helps illustrate it for you guys. So we covered quite a bit of math there. So hopefully this has been helpful for you guys. I would like to take a quick moment though to recap what we covered. And then Bob, you could let us know if there's any questions that came in that I could help with as well. So getting started for you guys, you'll want to determine the primary function of your website. I'm a categorical person. My wife makes fun of me for it, but it makes sense to be able to group these into categories. So we talked about e-com, lead gen, offline sales. There may be some other categories or however you want to group it, but the first thing you guys want to do is determine the primary function of your website. From there, you're going to want to identify the key metrics to track. And so the examples we used were revenue, phone calls, product pages, whatever the goal of your website is. And so that's on you guys. That's up to you, especially if your business is conducted offline, or if transactions are conducted offline. If you need a customer to come to a brick and mortar, if you need a customer to call you and schedule an appointment, it's very important for you to understand what the goal of your website is. And it's also, just some advice, it's important for you to make sure that it's easy for your customer to do that thing. So if your goal is phone numbers, your phone number should be prominent. It shouldn't be hidden. It shouldn't be difficult for them to find. Next, after you've identified the key metrics, after you've determined your primary function of your website, you should be able to calculate ROAS using the formula that we provided. And if necessary, estimate the revenue by connecting your transactions back to the primary metric on your site using the methodology that we just outlined on the previous slides. So hopefully that keeps it pretty simple for you guys. Lastly, I do want to touch on one thing, a few things, but how do we apply this to our advertising efforts? So the most important takeaway from today's webinar is that you guys are able to go back and establish and communicate your success benchmarks back to your digital marketing partners. Because if it's not communicated to them, what they perceive to be success may not be success in your eyes. In doing so, this allows you to diversify your media mix. So based on where you're seeing the most success. And so whether it's one platform or another, or even if it's different campaigns or ad groups within those platforms. Kind of also on a sidebar, I recommend looking for digital media partners that work in multiple platforms. So this makes it easier for you to communicate what success looks like. It makes it easier for them to optimize across channel because they're able to see the performance across multiple platforms. Lastly, it's important to note that it's not a one-time thing. You shouldn't establish your ROAS benchmark, and that shouldn't be your ROAS benchmark for the rest of the time you own your business. You should be looking into this and reevaluating and refining it with some sort of frequency, just to make sure that you're keeping up with any sort of changes that are occurring in the market or with your business. And with that, Bob, I'm going to kick it back over to you with any sort of questions that may have come up, or and if not, if you guys think of anything down the road, we'd love to be able to help you guys out here at AdTaxi.
Yeah, that was awesome, Drew. Appreciate it. No questions, but there was one comment when you were going through the BDP part that the way you broke it down really helped them understand kind of a little bit of the nuances on that. So they appreciate that. Also, you know, just what I'll add is I love the 3 examples that you gave in there, and that how different each company and each kind of type of business can be, and how you look at that. Whether you're looking at the phone calls, like in the plumbers, straight e-commerce is pretty straightforward, but the auto dealer definitely is a little bit more complex. And also, when you talk about communicating that to your digital partners, also, you know, I think a lot of people in a position, you got to communicate that up, sideways within your organization. Here's how we're looking at success. Here's how we're measuring it. This is what ROAS means to us. So I think you've given them a lot of food for thought on how to take this and apply it to their campaign, as well as, you know, make sure the organization is around this, because, you know, a lot of people, you know, I'm on that side where people start questioning marketing and our effectiveness and all that. And now when you're armed with these kind of tools, it only makes you that much better at that. And hold on a second. I got a question here. I just want to glance at it real quick. How would you recommend talking to clients who want the ROI for their earned media, like customer, online reviews, social media influence, etc.?
Read that again back to me, Bob.
How would you recommend talking to clients who want ROI for their earned media, like online reviews, social media influence, things like that? It's a little bit tougher, I can say that.
Yeah, I mean, so if I understand it correctly, how to apply ROI. So in order to apply ROI, we'll need to
just to clarify, just to make sure also, when you're looking at softer metrics like online reviews and social media influence or returns now, as she just commented, or ROAS.
Gotcha, ROAS.
I mean, I'll take a stab at that as well. I mean, when you're looking at like reviews, you know, how do you say what the value of that is? I don't know how, quite honestly, to quantify it. So I think it's one I'm going to have to look at and think about more. Or social media influence. If you have 30 likes, did it transfer into more ROI on that side? One thing I am studying right now, we're going to be launching in a couple months, is Amazon, or we're going to be doing a webinar on that. And online reviews, they're talking about can cost you a 3-star rating, can cost you 30% of your business. 4-star rating can count, you know, you can lose about 20% of your business rather than just having a 5-star. So in the realm of Amazon, on those reviews, there are ways that they have quantified out there what a review can mean in getting more business in that side. That's an incredibly good question, Amanda. It's a hard one to pinpoint. I'll kind of research a little bit more and get back to everyone.
I could touch on that too, Bob. So,
sure.
Yeah, I mean, we could have an entire webinar talking about that. So obviously, the way that I would approach it is to look at things holistically. So here's my marketing mix, and now in the case of the auto dealer, how many VDPs am I getting on my website? Now, how is each platform performing individually, but also how am I looking holistically? And then being able to assign a value on a particular platform, or to your point, Bob, it's extremely difficult. I always like to put myself in the customer's shoes, and so the example I use is and my team always makes fun of me because I bring this up a lot, but it is like, let's say that you're a plumber and you want to put up a billboard on the side of the interstate, and you want to measure the performance of that billboard. And so you put a phone number on that billboard and you put a tracking phone number on there. And so as a consumer, what is the likelihood that you're going to be driving down the interstate and you're going to see a billboard and you're going to say, my goodness, I need a plumber today. And so you pull over your car in the shoulder and you dial up that phone number and you call up the plumber and you schedule an appointment. It's meant to be comical, but the fact of the matter is that as a consumer, you see that billboard every single day you drive to and from work, but you're never going to call the phone number on that billboard. But lo and behold, the day that you need a plumber, like let's say you've got something's leaking, or even worse, where it's an emergency, you're not going to hop in your car and drive down the interstate to find that billboard so you can make a phone call. You're going to search for them. And so as you do a search, you're going to see probably 30 different other plumbers in your area that are all wanting your business too. Which ad are you going to click on? Well, you're going to click on the one that you trust the most, and so that's where reviews comes in there. You're also going to click on the ads that you could familiarize yourself most with. And so looking at reviews, but also familiarization with, I've seen that billboard every single day, they get good reviews, I'm going to click on this ad. You click on it, you go to the website, you make a phone call, you end up transacting. That poor billboard is going to get 0 credit for it, but it did influence that customer's action at the very end. And so it's a good question. It's difficult to be able to pinpoint the actual value of that billboard or of the reviews that you read. And I know that I know Facebook and Google, they're testing out what different attribution models, and so some are, and it really just kind of depends on how you think it fits best with your business. And so there's some that are time decay models, which are the further out, the less value, but there's still value. So if someone saw an ad and went to my website 10 minutes ago, that's going to have higher value than someone who saw my ad and went to my website maybe a week ago. And also depending on your business, depending on what the customer sales cycle looks like. If you're buying a house, it's a long sales cycle. But if you're buying some shoelaces, like if you saw the ad a week ago, it's going to have less value than if you saw it 10 minutes ago, if that makes sense. So time decay is one. There's equal. So it's basically every channel that touched you, every channel that touched that customer gets equal credit for it. There's different models. So yeah, check it out, or maybe Bob, that's something we could send out, is just a link to how Google's defining it, or looking at the different methodologies associated with it. But my advice is always start at the bottom and work your way back. And so in that case, in order for me to find the plumber, they would have been, I don't want to say they're wasting their money by doing the billboard, but they would have been wasting their money by doing the billboard if they didn't have their Google taken care of. Because I would have done the search and I wouldn't have seen their ad and I would have gone to someone else. So that was kind of a long-winded response, but hopefully that helps address it.
Yeah, it was a great question, and so appreciate that. And thanks for that answer. We will get back to the additional questions that continue to come in, and I appreciate everybody joining us for this week. And next week we're going to be, or in 2 weeks, we're going to be talking about summer events. So stay tuned for that. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.